I never thought a single night could change the course of my entire life, but that's exactly what happened on that crisp winter evening. My name is Amelia, and this is the story of how I lost everything and found myself in the process. It had been another long day at the office, the kind where the fluorescent lights seemed to drain every ounce of energy from your body. I remember trudging up the steps to our modest two-story house in the suburbs of Boston, my breath visible in the chilly air. As I fumbled with my keys, I could hear an unusual commotion inside. My husband, Richard, was never one for excitement. He was always the calm, collected type. That's why the sound of his animated voice through the door caught me off guard. I pushed open the door, the warmth of our home a welcome respite from the biting cold outside. The scene that greeted me was surreal. Richard was pacing back and forth in our living room, a piece of paper clutched tightly in his hands. His normally slicked-back hair was disheveled, as if he'd been running his fingers through it repeatedly. His eyes were wide, almost manic, and his movements were erratic. "Richard," I called out, setting my bag on the counter. "What's going on?" Before I could even shrug off my coat, he whirled around to face me. His face was flushed, a mix of excitement and something else I couldn't quite place. "Amelia," he shouted, his voice trembling with emotion. "I won $50 million. Can you believe it?" For a moment, I stood there, frozen in disbelief. $50 million? It seemed impossible, like something out of a dream. We'd been struggling financially for the better part of 2 years. The recession had hit Richard's small business hard, and we'd been drowning in debt, our dreams of starting a family put on indefinite hold. This windfall could change everything. My heart swelled with optimism as I pictured what this fortune could mean for our shared future. No more sleepless nights worrying about bills. No more arguments about whether we could afford to fix the leaky roof. We could finally start the family we'd always talked about. I rushed forward, throwing my arms around Richard. "Oh my God, that's incredible," I exclaimed, my own voice shaky with excitement. "How? When did this happen?" Richard pulled away from me, his eyes gleaming. "I bought a ticket on my way home from work yesterday. I almost forgot about it, but I checked the numbers this morning and, bam, we're rich, Amelia. We're set for life." As Richard's excitement grew, however, I noticed something unsettling in his demeanor. His usual warm tone had shifted into something colder, more distant. He wasn't talking about us or our life anymore, but instead his plans and his next steps. It was subtle at first, but as the evening wore on, it became impossible to ignore. "I'm thinking of buying that sports car I've always wanted," Richard mused, more to himself than to me. "And maybe we could look into a bigger house. Something with a view of the ocean." "That sounds wonderful," I said, trying to join in the planning. "We could finally take that trip to Europe we've been dreaming about, too." Richard's reaction to my suggestion caught me off guard. His face twisted into a look of irritation, as if I'd said something offensive. He scoffed. "Amelia, this is my win. I bought the ticket. I think I get to decide how to spend the money." I felt as if I'd been slapped. In all our years of marriage, Richard had never spoken to me like that. We'd always been a team, sharing our wins and losses equally. But now, it was as if overnight, I'd become an outsider in my own marriage. "Richard," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "I thought we were in this together. We've always shared everything." He laughed, but there was no warmth in it. "That was when we had nothing to share. Things are different now." As the night wore on, Richard's behavior became increasingly erratic. He made phone calls to his friends, bragging about his win and making grandiose promises. He even called his mother, Evelyn, who lived a few towns over. I could hear her shrill voice through the phone, her excitement matching Richard's. I tried to interject, to bring some sense of normalcy back to our evening, but Richard brushed off my attempts. It was as if I'd become invisible, a ghost in my own home. I went to bed alone that night, Richard still downstairs, lost in his fantasies of wealth. The next morning, I woke up hoping that things would be different. Maybe Richard had just been overwhelmed by the shock of winning. Maybe, in the light of day, he'd remember who we were and what we meant to each other. But as I made my way downstairs, I knew immediately that something was wrong. Richard was standing in the living room, a stack of papers in his hand. Behind him stood his mother, Evelyn, her lips curved into a smug smile. "Amelia," Richard said, his voice cold and businesslike. "We need to talk." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What's going on? Why is your mother here?" Richard thrust the papers towards me. As I took them, my heart sank. They were divorce papers. "You're not getting a dime from me," he spat, venom replacing any trace of the man I'd married. "Sign these papers and get out of my house. I don't owe you anything anymore." I stared at him in disbelief, my world crumbling around me. This couldn't be happening. Just yesterday, we were a normal couple, struggling but together. Now, because of a stroke of luck, I was being cast aside like yesterday's trash. Behind Richard, Evelyn clapped her hands, laughing as if the entire scenario was a comedy for her amusement. "That's right, Richard," she chimed in. "Expel this witch from your life. The money belongs to you." I looked from Richard to Evelyn and back again, searching for any sign of the people I thought I knew. But there was nothing familiar in their eyes, only cold, calculating greed. With shaking hands, I set the papers down on the coffee table. "You can't be serious," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Richard, we've been married for 5 years. We've been through so much together. How can you throw that all away?" But Richard's face remained impassive. "Sign the papers, Amelia. It's over." In that moment, I realized that the man I loved, the life we'd built together, had been nothing but an illusion. With no choice but to accept this abrupt betrayal, I numbly gathered what belongings I could carry. As I packed, Evelyn's taunting voice followed me from room to room, gleefully listing all the things Richard would buy with his money. An hour later, I stood on the front porch of what had been my home, a single duffel bag at my feet. The winter wind bit at my cheeks, but I barely felt it. The pain of betrayal was far colder. As I turned to leave, I caught one last glimpse of Richard through the window. He was already on his phone, probably making plans for his new life of luxury. A life that no longer included me. With a heavy heart, I walked down the driveway and into the frigid night, not daring to look back. I had no idea where I was going or what I would do next. All I knew was that in the span of a single night, everything I thought I knew about my life, my marriage, and the man I loved had been turned upside down. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a journey that would test me in ways I never imagined, and ultimately lead me to discover a strength I never knew I possessed. The neon sign of the Sleepy Pine Motel flickered weakly in the darkness, a beacon of last resort for those with nowhere else to go. And that night, I was one of those people. I trudged through the nearly empty parking lot, my duffel bag feeling heavier with each step. The night clerk barely looked up as I asked for a room, sliding a key across the worn counter without a word. Room 17 was exactly what you'd expect from a budget motel on the outskirts of Boston. A sagging bed, faded wallpaper, and a heater that rattled more than it heated. But it was a roof over my head, and right then, that was all I could ask for. I sank onto the bed, my mind reeling from the events of the past few hours. How had everything fallen apart so quickly? Just yesterday, Richard and I were planning our future together. Now, I was alone in a dingy motel room, with nothing but a bag of hastily packed clothes to my name. The dull hum of the ancient heater was the only sound breaking the oppressive silence. I hugged my knees to my chest, trying to make sense of it all. Richard's face kept flashing in my mind, not the loving husband I thought I knew, but this new, cruel version that the prospect of wealth had created. His words echoed in my head, "You're not getting a dime from me." How could money change someone so completely, so quickly? And then there was Evelyn, Richard's mother. Her cackling laughter as I packed my things still rang in my ears. She had never approved of me, always thinking Richard could do better. I guess in her eyes, $50 million was finally better enough. Sleep was elusive that night. I tossed and turned, replaying the day's events over and over. The excitement in Richard's eyes when he first told me about the win. The way his voice changed when he started talking about his money. The cold, businesslike tone when he handed me the divorce papers. Each memory was a knife twisting in my heart. As the first rays of dawn began to peek through the threadbare curtains, my exhausted mind drifted to a memory from the week before. It was a small moment, insignificant at the time, but now it blazed in my mind like a beacon. I had stopped at the corner store on my way home from work, a small ritual I had developed over the past few months. Life had been stressful, with Richard's business struggling and our mounting debts. These little stops, where I'd treat myself to a candy bar or, occasionally, a lottery ticket, were my way of injecting a bit of whimsy into our increasingly tense lives. That particular day, I remember picking up a small lottery ticket booklet. The cashier, a friendly older woman named Martha, had smiled at me. "Feeling lucky today, hun?" she'd asked. I had laughed, shaking my head. "Not really, but sometimes it's nice to dream, you know?" When I got home, I showed the ticket to Richard. We had joked about the absurdly low odds of winning, laughing at the idea of suddenly becoming millionaires. What would we even do with that much money? Richard had mused. "Pay off our debts, for starters," I had replied. "Maybe take that trip to Europe we've always talked about." Richard had nodded, his eyes distant. "Yeah, that would be nice," he had said, but there was something off in his tone. At the time, I had chalked it up to stress from work. Now, I wondered if that was the moment the seed of greed had been planted in his mind. But as I lay in that motel bed, staring at the water-stained ceiling, another detail from that memory surfaced. When I bought the ticket, I had registered it online, as I always did. And I had used my own name and email address. My eyes snapped open as the realization hit me. The winning ticket, the $50 million jackpot that had torn my life apart, was registered in my name, not Richard's. I sat up abruptly, my heart pounding. Could it be true? I scrambled for my laptop, thanking whatever deity might be listening that I had thought to grab it in my hasty packing. As I waited for it to boot up, my mind raced. If the ticket was in my name, that meant, what? The money was legally mine. Richard had no claim to it. With shaking hands, I logged into my email, scrolling frantically through my saved messages. And there it was, a confirmation email from the Lottery Commission, dated the day I bought the ticket. I clicked it open, my breath catching in my throat as I read the details. The ticket number matched the winning draw. The name on the registration was mine, Amelia Rossi. Not Richard Rossi. Mine. A hysterical laugh bubbled up from my chest. All this time, Richard had been crowing about his win, making plans for his money. But it wasn't his at all. It was mine. For a moment, I felt a surge of vindictive joy. Wouldn't it be perfect justice to call Richard right now and tell him the truth? To hear the shock in his voice as he realized he had thrown away our marriage for nothing? But as quickly as it came, the feeling faded, replaced by a deep, hollow sadness. Because even if the money was mine, it didn't change the fundamental truth of what had happened. Richard had still chosen wealth over our marriage. He had still revealed himself to be someone I didn't recognize, someone I couldn't trust or love. I closed my laptop and lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. Yesterday, I had nothing. Today, I was worth $50 million. But I felt no richer. If anything, I felt poorer than I ever had in my life. As the sun rose higher in the sky, painting the dingy motel room in shades of gold, I found myself at a crossroads. What was I going to do now? The money opened up a world of possibilities, but it also presented its own set of challenges. Richard would fight me for it, I was sure. And even if I managed to keep it all, how would it change me? Would I become like Richard, consumed by greed and selfishness? I thought about my job, my friends, the life I had built in Boston. Could I go back to any of that, knowing what I knew now? The idea of facing everyone, of explaining what had happened, made my stomach churn. No, I realized. I couldn't go back. But I could go forward. With a newfound sense of purpose, I got out of bed and started to plan. First things first, I needed to secure the winnings. That meant contacting the Lottery Commission and probably hiring a lawyer. I also needed to find a more permanent place to stay. As much as I was enjoying the ambience of the Sleepy Pine Motel, it wasn't exactly a long-term solution. As I jotted down my to-do list, I felt a spark of excitement ignite in my chest. For the first time in years, my future was entirely my own. No more compromising my dreams to support Richard's ambitions. No more biting my tongue around Evelyn to keep the peace. I could go anywhere, do anything. The question was, what did I want? I had always dreamed of traveling, of seeing the world beyond the confines of our small suburban life. Maybe now was my chance. I could take that trip to Europe we'd always talked about, but on my own terms. Or maybe I'd go further afield, Asia, Africa, South America. The whole world was open to me now. But first, I had a more immediate journey to embark on, the journey to reclaim my life and my sense of self. As I packed up my meager belongings and checked out of the motel, I felt a mix of emotions swirling in my chest. Fear, excitement, uncertainty, hope. But underlying it all was a steely determination. Richard and Evelyn had tried to cast me aside, to make me feel worthless. But they had underestimated me. I was stronger than they knew, stronger than I knew. And I was about to prove it. As I stepped out into the bright Boston morning, I took a deep breath of the crisp winter air. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, I felt a genuine smile tugging at my lips. A door had closed behind me, but another had opened. And I was ready to step through it, into whatever adventure awaited on the other side. Little did I know, the most challenging and rewarding chapter of my life was just beginning. The next few days passed in a blur of phone calls, meetings, and paperwork. I found a small apartment to rent month to month, nothing fancy, but it was clean, quiet, and most importantly, mine. It became my sanctuary as I navigated the choppy waters of my new reality. My first call had been to a lawyer, a sharp-minded woman named Sarah who specialized in lottery cases. She listened to my story with a mix of sympathy and professional interest, then laid out a game plan to secure my winnings. The good news, she told me, is that the ticket is clearly registered in your name. Legally, the money is yours. But given the circumstances, we should expect your husband to contest it. I nodded, a knot forming in my stomach at the thought of facing Richard in court. But Sarah's next words helped ease my anxiety. Don't worry, Amelia. We'll be prepared for whatever he throws at us. With Sarah's guidance, I contacted the Lottery Commission and started the process of claiming my winnings. It would take some time for everything to be finalized, but at least the wheels were in motion. As I settled into my new apartment and my new life, I found myself oscillating between a range of emotions. One moment, I'd be filled with excitement at the possibilities that lay ahead. The next, I'd be overwhelmed by grief for the life and love I'd lost. And sometimes, when I least expected it, a simmering anger would bubble up inside me. Anger at Richard for his betrayal, at Evelyn for her cruel glee, and at myself for not seeing the truth about them sooner. I spent most of my time in the apartment, partly out of a desire for privacy and partly out of fear of running into Richard or anyone who knew us. But I couldn't hide forever, and I knew it. The confrontation I'd been dreading was inevitable. It came sooner than I expected. Just 3 days after I'd left our home, I was jolted awake by a rapid, aggressive knocking at my door. For a moment, I lay frozen in bed, my heart pounding. Then the knocking came again, even louder this time, accompanied by a voice I knew all too well. Amelia, I know you're in there. Open the door. Richard. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come. I pulled on a robe and made my way to the door, my bare feet silent on the cool hardwood floor. I opened the door to find Richard standing there, his appearance a shock after years of seeing him impeccably groomed. His hair was unkempt, his clothes rumpled as if he'd slept in them. But it was his eyes that caught me off guard. They were red-rimmed and wild, darting around frantically before settling on me. Where is it, Amelia? He thundered, pushing past me into the apartment without waiting for an invitation. The scent of alcohol wafted off him, turning my stomach. Where's my money? I checked my account this morning, and the jackpot didn't go through. You stole it, didn't you? How could you do this to me? I stood there for a moment, stunned by his audacity. After everything he'd done, he had the nerve to accuse me of stealing? A surge of anger rose within me, burning away my initial shock. Your money? I asked, my voice dripping with mockery. I crossed my arms, observing him calmly as he paced around my small living room like a caged animal. Didn't you check the ticket, Richard? Whose name is listed as the winner? My question hung in the air like a thunderclap. Richard froze mid-stride, his face draining of color as my words sank in. I could almost see the gears turning in his head as he processed what I was saying. He fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking as he pulled it from his pocket. I watched as he frantically searched for something, probably the confirmation email he thought he had. "No," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "No, that's not possible. I bought the ticket. I checked the numbers. It's my win." "You may have bought the ticket," I said, my voice steady despite the tumult of emotions inside me. "But I registered it. In my name. Just like I've done with every lottery ticket we've ever bought." Richard's head snapped up, his eyes meeting mine. The look of desperation on his face almost made me pity him. "Almost. You. It's in your name," he stammered, his arrogance crumbling to reveal raw panic. I nodded, a grim satisfaction settling over me. "That's right, Richard. The $50 million you were so quick to claim as your own. It's mine. All of it." The change that came over Richard in that moment was astonishing. The angry, accusatory man who had barged into my apartment just minutes ago seemed to deflate before my eyes. His shoulders slumped, his face crumpled, and without warning, his legs gave out from under him. I watched in shock as my husband, soon-to-be ex-husband, collapsed onto my living room floor. For a moment, I thought he was playing some kind of trick. But as the seconds ticked by and he remained motionless, I realized this was no act. "Richard," I called, taking a cautious step towards him. When he didn't respond, I knelt beside him, my anger temporarily forgotten in the face of potential medical emergency. "Richard, can you hear me?" His eyes were open, but unfocused, staring blankly at the ceiling. His breathing was shallow and rapid. With a jolt of alarm, I recognized the signs of a panic attack. I'd had enough of them myself in the past few days to know what they looked like. Despite everything, I couldn't just leave him like this. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, quickly explaining the situation to the operator. As I waited for the paramedics to arrive, I sat on the floor next to Richard, unsure what to do. Part of me wanted to comfort him, to tell him everything would be okay. But another part, the part that remembered his cruel words, his easy dismissal of our years together, held me back. The paramedics arrived within minutes, their efficient professionalism a stark contrast to the emotional chaos of the past hour. They quickly assessed Richard, confirming my suspicion of a panic attack. With their help, Richard was able to sit up, his breathing slowly returning to normal. As color returned to his cheeks, I saw shame and embarrassment creep into his expression. He couldn't meet my eyes as the paramedics asked him questions, his responses little more than mumbled monosyllables. Once they were satisfied that Richard wasn't in any immediate danger, the paramedics prepared to leave. One of them turned to me, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners. "Will you be okay here, Or would you like us to take him to the hospital for further observation?" I looked at Richard, still sitting on my floor, looking lost and small. In that moment, I saw not the man who had cruelly cast me aside, but the man I had loved for years. The man I had built a life with, shared dreams with. And despite everything, I felt a pang of sympathy. "We'll be fine," I heard myself say. "Thank you for coming." After the paramedics left, an awkward silence fell over the apartment. Richard remained on the floor, his eyes fixed on his hands. I stood by the window, looking out at the city waking up, unsure what to do or say next. Finally, Richard spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry, Amelia. I don't know what came over me. When I realized the money wasn't in my account, I panicked. I thought you had somehow taken it from me." I turned to face him, crossing my arms. "Taken it from you?" I repeated, unable to keep the edge out of my voice. "Richard, it was never yours to begin with." He nodded, still not meeting my eyes. "I know that now. I got so caught up in the idea of being rich. Of all the things I could do, all the problems I could solve. I didn't stop to think about us." "No," I said softly. "You didn't." Richard finally looked up at me, his eyes red-rimmed and pleading. Can we talk about this?" Maybe we can work something out. Split the money, maybe. We could still have the life we always dreamed of. For a moment, I was tempted. The idea of going back to our life, of pretending none of this had happened, was seductive in its simplicity. But then I remembered the look in Richard's eyes when he handed me those divorce papers. The sound of Evelyn's laughter as I packed my things. I shook my head. No, Richard. We can't go back. You showed me who you really are when you thought you had all that money. I can't unsee that. But Amelia, he started, desperation creeping into his voice. I held up a hand, cutting him off. I think you should go now, Richard. My lawyer will be in touch about the divorce proceedings. He opened his mouth as if to argue, then closed it again. Slowly, he got to his feet, swaying slightly. As he made his way to the door, he paused, turning back to me one last time. I really am sorry, Amelia. For everything. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. And then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft click that seemed to echo in the sudden silence of my apartment. I sank onto my couch, emotionally drained. The confrontation I'd been dreading was over, but it had left me with more questions than answers. As the first rays of sunlight began to stream through my window, I realized that this was just the beginning. The real battle, for the money, for my future, for my sense of self, was still to come. But for the first time since this whole ordeal began, I felt ready to face it. Whatever challenges lay ahead, I would meet them head-on. Because now I knew the truth, I was stronger than Richard, stronger than Evelyn, stronger than anyone had given me credit for. And I was ready to prove it. The days following Richard's unexpected visit were a whirlwind of emotions and activity. I threw myself into the process of securing my lottery winnings, grateful for the distraction it provided from the turmoil of my personal life. Sarah, my lawyer, was a godsend during this time. She navigated the complex legal waters with a confidence that I found reassuring, always ready with a plan for every potential obstacle. We've filed all the necessary paperwork with the Lottery Commission, Sarah informed me during one of our meetings. Given the circumstances, they're expediting the process. With any luck, the funds should be transferred to the secure account we've set up within the next few weeks. I nodded, still somewhat dazed by the enormity of it all. And Richard? Do you think he'll try to contest it? Sarah's expression turned thoughtful. It's possible. The ticket is clearly registered in your name, which gives us a strong legal standing. But given the amount of money involved, we should be prepared for him to try something. As if on cue, my phone buzzed with a text from Richard. I hesitated before opening it, steeling myself for more accusations or pleas. Instead, I found something unexpected. Amelia, I've been thinking about everything. I know I messed up. Is there any chance we could talk? Maybe over coffee? I promise I just want to talk. I stared at the message, conflicting emotions warring inside me. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to continue moving forward without looking back. But another part, the part that still remembered the good times we'd shared, was tempted to hear him out. What do you think? I asked Sarah, showing her the message. She frowned, her legal mind clearly working through the implications. It's your decision, Amelia. But if you do decide to meet him, I'd strongly advise against discussing anything related to the lottery or the divorce proceedings without me present. In the end, curiosity won out. I agreed to meet Richard at a small cafe not far from my apartment. As I waited for him, nervously stirring my latte, I couldn't help but remember all the times we'd sat in cafes like this, planning our future together. It seemed like a lifetime ago. Richard arrived looking more like his old self, clean-shaven, hair neatly combed, wearing the blue button-down shirt I'd always liked on him. But there was a new hesitancy in his movements, a wariness in his eyes as he approached the table. "Thanks for meeting me, Amelia," he said, sliding into the seat across from me. I wasn't sure you would." I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. "What did you want to talk about, Richard?" He took a deep breath, his fingers fidgeting with the sugar packets on the table. "I wanted to apologize. Really apologize, not like the other day when I was, well, you know. I've had some time to think, and I realize now how terribly I behaved." I listened silently as Richard continued, pouring out his regrets and explanations. He talked about the stress he'd been under with his failing business, about how the prospect of sudden wealth had gone to his head. "I got caught up in a fantasy," he admitted, his voice thick with shame. "I imagined all the problems money could solve, all the things I could finally do. I lost sight of what really mattered." As I watched him, I felt a complicated mix of emotions. There was still anger there, and hurt, but also a twinge of sympathy. I recognized the man sitting across from me. This was more like the Richard I had known and loved for years. "I know I don't deserve it," Richard said, finally meeting my eyes, "but I was hoping, maybe we could try to work things out. Start over." For a moment, I was tempted. The idea of going back to our life, of pretending the past week had never happened, was seductive in its simplicity. But then I remembered the cold look in his eyes when he'd handed me those divorce papers, the easy way he'd cast aside years of love and partnership. I shook my head slowly. "I'm sorry, Richard, but no. Too much has happened. I can't go back to the way things were, pretending I don't know what I know now." Richard's face fell, but he nodded, as if he'd expected this response. "I understand. I had to try, you know?" We sat in silence for a few moments, the awkwardness between us palpable. Finally, Richard spoke again, his voice hesitant. "So, what happens now? With the money, I mean." I felt my guard go up immediately. "I think it's best if we let our lawyers handle that discussion, Richard." He opened his mouth as if to argue, then thought better of it. "You're right, of course. I hope you know that I never meant for things to get so messy." As we said our goodbyes, I couldn't shake the feeling that this conversation wasn't really over. And I was right. The next morning, I was startled awake by a loud, insistent knocking at my door. For a moment, I feared it was Richard again, but the voice I heard calling my name wasn't his. "Amelia, open this door right now. We need to talk." I groaned, recognizing the shrill tones of Evelyn, Richard's mother. Pulling on a robe, I made my way to the door, bracing myself for the confrontation to come. I barely had time to unlock the door before Evelyn burst in, her face flushed with anger. "How dare you," she spat, jabbing a finger at me. "How dare you try to steal my son's money?" I blinked, momentarily taken aback by her vehemence. "Evelyn, I'm not stealing anything. The ticket was in my name. The money is legally mine," she scoffed, pacing my small living room like a caged animal. "Don't give me that nonsense. We all know Richard bought that ticket. He's the one who deserves that money, not some gold-digging little tramp like you." Her words stung, but I forced myself to remain calm. "I'm not discussing this with you, Evelyn. If Richard has concerns about the lottery winnings, he can have his lawyer contact mine." "Oh, don't act all high and mighty with me," Evelyn sneered. "I know your type. You've been planning this all along, haven't you? Waiting for your chance to take everything from my Richard." I felt my temper rising, the calm I'd been trying to maintain slipping away. "Take everything from him? Are you serious? Do you have any idea what I've been through in this marriage? The debts I've paid off, the dreams I've put on hold?" Evelyn waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, please. Richard has given you a good life. A nice home, vacations, that ridiculous art class you were always going on about. That ridiculous art class was the only thing I did for myself in years." I shot back, my voice rising. Everything else was about supporting Richard, his business, his ambitions. And the moment he thought he had money, he was ready to throw me away like yesterday's trash. For a moment, Evelyn seemed taken aback by my outburst. But she quickly rallied. "Well, what did you expect? That's what marriage is, dear. Supporting your husband. If you can't handle that, maybe it's best you two split up after all." I stared at her, hardly able to believe what I was hearing. "If that's what you think marriage is, Evelyn, I feel sorry for you. A real partnership is about supporting each other, not one person sacrificing everything for the other." Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "Don't you dare pity me, you ungrateful little witch. I raised a successful son, I've been married for 40 years. What do you know about real partnership?" I took a deep breath, trying to center myself. I know that it doesn't involve throwing your spouse away the moment you think you've come into money. I know it doesn't involve manipulating and undermining your daughter-in-law for years. And I definitely know it doesn't involve barging into someone's home and hurling insults at them. For a moment, Evelyn seemed at a loss for words. Then her face twisted into a sneer. You think you're so clever, don't you? Well, let me tell you something. That money belongs to this family. Richard is part of this family. You're nothing. Just a gold digger who got lucky. And we'll make sure everyone knows it. With that, she stormed out of my apartment, slamming the door behind her with enough force to rattle the windows. I sank onto my couch, my hands shaking. The confrontation had left me feeling drained and angry. But underneath the turmoil of emotions, I felt something else stirring, a sense of resolve, of determination. For years, I had bent over backward to please Richard and Evelyn. I had swallowed my pride, set aside my own dreams, all in the name of being a good wife and daughter-in-law. And where had it gotten me? Betrayed, insulted, and alone. No more, I decided. No more trying to please people who clearly had no respect for me. No more sacrificing my own happiness for others who wouldn't do the same for me. I reached for my phone, dialing Sarah's number. When she answered, I didn't waste any time with pleasantries. Sarah, it's Amelia. I need your advice. Richard's mother just left my apartment after verbally attacking me. I'm worried she and Richard might try to smear my name or contest the lottery winnings. What can we do to protect ourselves? As Sarah began outlining our options, I felt a sense of calm settling over me. This wasn't the life I had imagined for myself, but it was the life I had now. And I was determined to face it head-on, with all the strength and courage I could muster. The battle lines had been drawn. Richard and Evelyn had shown their true colors. Now it was time for me to show mine. I may have started this journey as a victim, but I was determined to end it as a victor. Whatever challenges lay ahead, I would face them. Because now I knew the truth, I was stronger than they ever gave me credit for. And I was ready to prove it to them, and to myself. The weeks following my confrontations with Richard and Evelyn were a whirlwind of activity. With Sarah's expert guidance, we navigated the complex process of claiming my lottery winnings. It was a surreal experience, watching my bank balance go from barely covering my rent to a number with more zeros than I could have ever imagined. Congratulations, Amelia, Sarah said, a rare smile gracing her usually serious face as we finalized the paperwork. You're officially a multimillionaire. I stared at the statement in front of me, my mind struggling to process the reality of it. I don't even know what to do with all this money, I admitted, feeling a bit overwhelmed. Sarah's expression turned thoughtful. My advice? Take some time to think about what you really want. Don't make any hasty decisions. And whatever you do, don't tell anyone about your winnings just yet. I nodded, grateful for her wisdom. As I left her office that day, I felt a strange mix of excitement and trepidation. The money opened up a world of possibilities, but it also brought its own set of challenges. True to Sarah's advice, I kept the news of my winnings to myself. I needed time to process everything that had happened and to figure out my next steps. But as the days passed, I found myself grappling with an unexpected emotion: guilt. Here I was, suddenly wealthy beyond my wildest dreams, while so many people were struggling. It didn't feel right to simply hoard all that money for myself. That's when I had an idea. I reached out to a local women's shelter, the same one that had helped me years ago when I was trying to leave an abusive relationship before I met Richard. I remembered how their support had been a lifeline during one of the darkest periods of my life. I'd like to make a donation, I told the director, Carol, over the phone. A substantial one. Carol's surprise was evident in her voice. That's very generous of you, Amelia. May I ask what prompted this? I hesitated, not wanting to reveal too much about my situation. Let's just say I've come into some money recently, and I want to use it to help others who are going through tough times. We arranged a meeting, and a few days later, I found myself sitting in Carol's modest office. The shelter hadn't changed much since I'd last been there. It was still a bit shabby, but warm and welcoming. So, Amelia, Carol said, her kind eyes studying me curiously, What did you have in mind for your donation? I took a deep breath. I want to establish a fund, I began, my voice growing stronger as I spoke. A fund to help women who are trying to leave abusive situations or rebuild their lives after divorce. It could cover things like legal fees, job training, childcare, whatever they need to get back on their feet. Carol's eyes widened. That's incredibly generous, Amelia. But it would require a significant amount of money to set up something like that. I nodded, a small smile playing on my lips. I know. I'm prepared to donate $5 million to start. The look of shock on Carol's face was almost comical. $5 million, she stammered. Amelia, that's extraordinary. Are you sure? I'm sure, I said, feeling more certain than I had in weeks. This shelter helped me when I needed it most. Now I want to pay it forward. As we worked out the details of the fund, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. For the first time since winning the lottery, I felt like I was doing something meaningful with the money. But my journey of self-discovery and rebuilding didn't stop there. With my immediate future secure, I decided it was time to focus on something I'd been putting off for years, my own dreams and aspirations. I'd always loved art, but I'd set aside my paintbrushes years ago to focus on supporting Richard's career. Now, with time and resources at my disposal, I decided to reignite that passion. I enrolled in art classes at a local studio, feeling both excited and nervous as I walked into my first session. The room was filled with the scent of paint and the soft murmur of conversation. As I set up my easel, I couldn't help but feel a bit out of place. "First time?" a friendly voice asked. I turned to see a woman about my age smiling at me. She introduced herself as Lisa. "Is it that obvious?" I laughed, feeling myself relax a bit. Lisa shook her head. "Not at all. I just remember feeling the same way when I started. Don't worry, you'll fit right in." As the weeks passed, I found myself looking forward to my art classes more and more. There was something incredibly freeing about losing myself in the act of creation, letting my emotions flow onto the canvas. And to my surprise, I wasn't half bad at it. "You've got a real talent," Amelia, our instructor, David, told me one day as he examined my latest piece. "Have you ever thought about showing your work?" The idea both thrilled and terrified me. "I don't know," I said hesitantly. "I'm still learning." David smiled encouragingly. "We're all still learning. But your work has something special. It's raw and honest. People respond to that." His words stayed with me long after the class ended. As I worked on my paintings at home, I found myself pouring more and more of my experiences into my art. The pain of Richard's betrayal, the fear and uncertainty of starting over, the joy of rediscovering myself, it all found its way onto my canvases. It was Lisa who finally convinced me to take the plunge. "There's a small gallery downtown that showcases local artists," she told me one day after class. "They're having an open submission for their next exhibition. You should enter some of your work." After much deliberation, I decided to go for it. I selected 3 of my best pieces, a triptych that represented my journey from betrayal to freedom, and submitted them to the gallery. Weeks passed, and I tried not to get my hopes up. Then, one afternoon, I received an email that made my heart skip a beat. The gallery wanted to include my work in their upcoming exhibition. The night of the exhibition opening, I stood in front of my paintings, feeling a mix of pride and vulnerability. My work was out there for everyone to see, my emotions laid bare on canvas. "These are remarkable," a voice said behind me. I turned to see an older woman studying my triptych intently. "The emotion in these pieces is palpable. Are you the artist?" I nodded, introducing myself. The woman smiled, holding out her hand. "I'm Eleanor. I own a larger gallery across town. I'd love to talk to you about potentially showing more of your work." As I chatted with Eleanor, I felt a surge of excitement. This was more than I'd ever dreamed of when I first picked up a paintbrush again. But more than that, I felt a sense of validation. My experiences, my pain, my growth, they meant something. They resonated with people. Later that night, as I sipped champagne and basked in the glow of my small success, I couldn't help but reflect on how far I'd come. Just a few months ago, I'd been a shell of myself, trapped in a marriage that had lost its warmth. Now, I was standing on my own 2 feet, pursuing my passion, and making a difference in others' lives. The journey hadn't been easy. There had been moments of doubt, of fear, of loneliness. But as I looked around the gallery, at the people engaged with my art, at the friends I'd made in my classes, I realized something important. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving. The money from the lottery had opened doors for me, true. But it was my own strength, my own resilience, that had pushed me through those doors. I had rebuilt my life on my own terms, and I was proud of the woman I was becoming. As I left the gallery that night, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The future was still uncertain in many ways, but for the first time in a long time, I was excited to face it. Whatever challenges lay ahead, I knew I had the strength to meet them head-on. My new life was just beginning, and I couldn't wait to see where it would take me next. As the seasons changed and months rolled into years, my new life began to take shape in ways I never could have imagined. The girl who once lived in fear of her husband's mood swings and mother-in-law's cutting remarks was gone, replaced by a woman who stood tall and faced the world with confidence. My art career, which had started as a way to process my emotions, blossomed into something more. After that first gallery showing, doors began to open. Eleanor, true to her word, featured my work in her downtown gallery. The response was overwhelming. "Your pieces speak to people, Amelia," Eleanor told me after my first solo exhibition. "There's a rawness, a honesty in your work that resonates with viewers." I smiled, thinking of the journey each painting represented. "I guess I've had a lot to process," I replied. As my reputation grew, so did the demands on my time. I found myself juggling interviews, commission requests, and invitations to art fairs across the country. It was exhilarating and exhausting in equal measure. But through it all, I never forgot where I came from or the people who had helped me along the way. The Women's Shelter Fund I had set up continued to grow, helping countless women escape abusive situations and rebuild their lives. I made it a point to visit the shelter regularly, speaking with the women there and offering whatever support I could. It was during one of these visits that I met Sophia, a young mother of 2 who reminded me so much of myself from years ago. Her eyes held the same fear and uncertainty I once felt, but there was a spark of determination there too. "I don't know how to start over," Sophia confessed to me one day, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been with him for so long, I don't know who I am without him." I took her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "I know it feels impossible now," I said, "but trust me, you're stronger than you know. Starting over is scary, but it's also an opportunity to rediscover yourself." As I mentored Sophia and other women like her, I found a new purpose. My experiences, painful as they had been, could serve as a beacon of hope for others. It was a responsibility I took seriously, and it added a depth to my life that no amount of money could buy. Speaking of money, I had learned to use my wealth wisely. Besides the Women's Shelter Fund, I set up scholarships for aspiring artists from underprivileged backgrounds and donated to various charities close to my heart. The joy of giving back far outweighed any material pleasures my newfound wealth could provide. But life, as I had learned, is never without its challenges. About 2 years after my lottery win, I received a letter that brought my past crashing back into my present. It was from Richard. My hands shook as I opened the envelope, unsure of what to expect. The letter inside was several pages long, filled with Richard's messy scrawl. "Dear Amelia," it began, "I'm not sure if you'll even read this, and I wouldn't blame you if you didn't. But I needed to write to you, to try and explain, and to apologize." I sank into my favorite armchair, steeling myself as I read on. Richard's letter was a rambling mix of apologies and explanations. He wrote about how his life had fallen apart after our divorce. His attempt to contest the lottery win had failed spectacularly, leaving him with mounting legal bills. His business, already struggling, had collapsed under the weight of bad publicity and his own mismanagement. "I hit rock bottom," he wrote. "I was drinking too much, gambling away what little money I had left. I pushed away everyone who tried to help me. It took losing everything to make me realize how much I'd thrown away." Richard went on to explain that he'd finally sought help. He'd been in rehab for his gambling addiction and was attending therapy regularly. He was working a regular job now, slowly rebuilding his life from the ground up. "I don't expect your forgiveness," the letter concluded. "I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know that I understand now how terribly I treated you. You deserved so much better, and I'm truly sorry for all the pain I caused you." As I finished reading, I was surprised to find tears rolling down my cheeks. Not tears of sadness or anger, but of relief. For so long, a part of me had been waiting for the other shoe to drop, for Richard or Evelyn to come bursting back into my life with more demands and accusations. This letter, with its humble admissions and apologies, felt like the closing of a chapter. I didn't respond to Richard's letter immediately. Instead, I took some time to process my feelings. I discussed it with my therapist, a wise woman named Dr. Chen, who had been instrumental in helping me work through my trauma. "You don't owe him a response," Dr. Chen reminded me gently. "Your healing doesn't depend on his apology or on forgiving him. What matters is how you feel." I nodded, grateful as always for her insight. "I know," I said. "But I think I want to respond. Not for him, but for me. To really close this chapter of my life." So, after much thought, I sat down to write back to Richard. My letter was brief but honest. I thanked him for his apology and expressed my hope that he would continue on his path of recovery. I also made it clear that while I appreciated his words, our paths had diverged for good. "I wish you well, Richard," I wrote, "but our life together is in the past. I've moved on, and I hope you can too." Sending that letter felt like releasing a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. It was closure, on my own terms. As for Evelyn, I heard through the grapevine that she had faced her own comeuppance. Her attempts to manipulate the situation had backfired spectacularly, leading to her being ostracized from her social circles. The last I heard, she had moved to Florida, away from the whispers and judgmental looks of our old community. With my past finally put to rest, I threw myself into my future with renewed energy. My art continued to evolve, reflecting my growth and the new perspectives I'd gained. I started a mentorship program for young artists, passing on the lessons I'd learned about resilience and self-expression through art. I also decided it was time for a change of scenery. I bought a beautiful house on the coast of Maine, with a studio that overlooked the ocean. The rhythmic crashing of waves became the backdrop to my life, a constant reminder of the ebb and flow of existence. It was there, in my coastal sanctuary, that I began work on what would become my most acclaimed series yet. Titled Phoenix Rising, it was a collection of paintings that chronicled my journey from the ashes of my old life to the vibrant, fulfilling existence I now led. As I stood in my gallery on opening night, surrounded by friends, fellow artists, and art enthusiasts, I felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over me. My eyes traveled from canvas to canvas, each one a testament to the challenges I'd overcome and the strength I'd found within myself. There was the betrayal, dark and chaotic, representing the night my world had shattered. Next to it hung the awakening, where hints of light began to break through the darkness. The rebirth exploded with color and hope, while the ascension showed a figure, unmistakably me, rising above the turbulence, wings outstretched. "It's breathtaking, Amelia," a voice said beside me. I turned to see Lisa, my friend from my first art class, smiling warmly at me. "You've come so far." I returned her smile, feeling a lump form in my throat. "We both have," I replied, thinking of how much Lisa's friendship had meant to me over the years. As the night wore on and praise for my work flowed freely, I found myself stepping out onto the gallery's balcony for a moment of quiet reflection. The cool night air carried the scent of salt from the nearby ocean, and the sky was alive with stars. I thought about the twists and turns my life had taken. The pain, the betrayal, the fear, but also the joy, the friendship, the self-discovery. Every experience, good and bad, had led me to this moment. The door behind me opened, and Eleanor joined me on the balcony. "Quite a night," she said, her eyes twinkling. "You should be proud, Amelia. You've created something truly special." I nodded, a sense of peace settling over me. "You know," I said, "a few years ago, I thought winning the lottery was the best thing that ever happened to me. But I was wrong." Eleanor raised an eyebrow, intrigued.
Oh,
I smiled, looking out at the twinkling lights of the city below. The best thing that ever happened to me was learning to stand on my own 2 feet. To trust myself, to pursue my passions, to give back to others. The money opened doors, sure. But it was me who chose to walk through them. Eleanor squeezed my shoulder affectionately. Well, I for one am glad you did. Now, come back inside. Your public awaits. As I followed Eleanor back into the gallery, I felt a flutter of excitement for what the future might hold. My journey had been far from easy, but it had led me to a life richer and more fulfilling than I ever could have imagined. The scared, uncertain woman who had walked out of her home with nothing but a duffel bag was gone. In her place stood an artist, a mentor, a philanthropist, a woman who had taken control of her own story and turned it into something beautiful. And as I mingled with the crowd, discussing my art and the inspirations behind it, I knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning. The best chapters of my life were still waiting to be written, and I couldn't wait to see where they would lead.